Is it possible for a civilization to commit suicide? Not with swords or armies, but with an idea. An idea so seductive, so potent, that it convinces the most powerful people on Earth to meticulously, generation by generation, engineer their own destruction from the inside out. This isn't a hypothetical question. It is the secret history of the greatest empire of the ancient world.
Welcome to Secrets of the Ancients, where ancient mysteries awaken.
Today, we journey into the golden heart of ancient Egypt, not just to marvel at its pyramids and temples, but to uncover a terrifying truth hidden within the very DNA of its rulers. It is a story of how the quest for divine purity created a 3,000-year-long genetic disaster. The great 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." For the pharaohs of Egypt, the abyss was not an external enemy, but an internal one. It was the reflection they saw in the polished bronze mirrors of their palaces, a reflection that, over centuries, became increasingly monstrous. They believed they were gazing at the face of a god, but the abyss of their own biology was gazing back, and it would eventually consume them. This is the story of that abyss. To comprehend the scale of Egypt's royal genetic catastrophe, we must first understand the foundational idea upon which their entire civilization was built. It is an idea far more powerful than any stone pyramid. The belief that the pharaoh was not merely a king, not just a representative of the gods, but a living god on earth. He was Horus incarnate, the son of Osiris, and his blood was not the common fluid of mortals but the ichor of the divine, a direct inheritance from the sun god Ra himself. This was not simply a political statement. It was the central axiom of their reality, the organizing principle of their cosmos. The stability of the universe, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the turning of the seasons, was metaphysically linked to the purity and health of the pharaoh and his lineage. In such a worldview, who could a god possibly marry? The question answers itself. To marry a mortal, a subject, no matter how noble, would be a form of cosmic contamination. It would be diluting the divine with the profane, weakening the very fabric of reality. Thus, from a theological and political perspective, the practice of royal incest, brother marrying sister, father marrying daughter, was not a transgression. It was a sacred necessity. It was the ultimate act of preserving order, or mad, in the universe. The first pharaoh who looked upon his sister and saw her not just as a sibling, but as the only worthy divine consort, was not acting out of perversion, but out of what he and his entire court would have seen as profound piety and political genius. This decision created a closed system. Politically, it was brilliant. It eliminated the rise of powerful noble families who might challenge the throne through marriage alliances. It concentrated power, wealth, and legitimacy within a single, tightly controlled genetic loop. No ambitious father-in-law could plot to place his grandson on the throne if the pharaoh was his own father-in-law. It was a perfect, self-sustaining political engine. But in biology, as in ideology, a closed system is a dead end. It is a system that cannot adapt, cannot absorb new information, and is doomed to collapse under the weight of its own accumulating errors. The priests who sanctioned these unions, the viziers who praised them, and the pharaohs who enacted them were masters of theology, politics, and engineering. They were, however, utterly ignorant of genetics. They could not know that they were systematically eliminating genetic diversity, the very mechanism that nature uses to protect against harmful recessive genes. Each marriage between siblings was like adding a drop of colorless poison to the family well. The first generation might only notice a slightly unusual taste. A child born with a minor facial irregularity, a slightly odd gait. The court would have rationalized these as marks of divinity, unique features befitting a unique bloodline. But the poison was accumulating. Recessive genes, for conditions like clubfoot, scoliosis, cleft palates, compromised immune systems, and hormonal imbalances, which are normally rare and masked by healthy dominant genes from an unrelated parent, were now being passed down from both sides. With every incestuous union, the odds of a child inheriting two copies of a harmful recessive gene increased exponentially. A 25% chance for each and every recessive trait. Over generations, this is not a risk. It is a statistical certainty. The genetic well was becoming saturated with poison. The very act they believed was preserving their divine nature was, in fact, systematically eroding their human biology, proving their mortality in the most brutal way imaginable. This was the foundational error, the divine mistake that would echo down 3 millennia of Egyptian history, reaching its horrifying crescendo in the sun-drenched, golden, and tormented world of the 18th dynasty. In the 14th century BCE, the slow-burning genetic crisis that had been smoldering for centuries erupted into a full-blown inferno. It manifested in the body of a single man who would, in turn, set the world on fire. He was born Amenhotep IV, but he would become Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. To look upon the art of Akhenaten's reign is to look upon the physical manifestation of generations of inbreeding. The images are shocking, even today. The pharaoh is depicted with a strangely elongated skull, a long, thin neck, wide, feminine hips, a protruding belly, and spindly limbs. This was not, as early Egyptologists once thought, a mere artistic convention or stylistic choice. The discovery and analysis of royal mummies from this period, including that of his probable son Tutankhamun, confirmed that the art was a hauntingly realistic portrayal of severe genetic abnormalities. Akhenaten likely suffered from a collection of syndromes, perhaps Marfan syndrome, which affects connective tissue, and Froehlich syndrome, which causes obesity and underdeveloped gonads, all compounded by the foundational genetic damage of his lineage. Imagine the psychological reality of this man. He was raised to believe he was a living god, yet every glance at his own reflection showed him a distorted, almost grotesque figure, utterly unlike the powerful, virile images of his ancestors carved on every temple wall. The whispers in the palace, the averted gazes of servants, the elaborate theological justifications crafted by priests to explain his appearance. It must have created an unbearable cognitive dissonance. This is where we must step beyond mere history and into the realm of political philosophy and psychology. Was Akhenaten's religious revolution, his decision to abandon Egypt's entire pantheon of gods in favor of a single deity, the sun disk Aten, a genuine spiritual revelation? Or was it the desperate act of a man at war with his own body and the gods he blamed for it? A compelling analysis suggests the latter. If the traditional gods, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Horus, had allowed their divine bloodline to become so physically corrupted, then perhaps they were false gods. If the old religion produced this, a frail, deformed pharaoh, then the old religion must be wrong. In a breathtaking act of psychological projection, Akhenaten did not see himself as a flawed vessel of the divine. He concluded that the divine must look exactly like him. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new, purpose-built city in the desert called Amarna. This was not just a political move. It was an act of profound isolation. He was quarantining himself and his pure new religion from the contamination of the old world. At Amarna, he created a new reality. He ordered his artists to abandon millennia of idealized, conventional royal portraiture and to depict the royal family as they truly were. The elongated skulls, the swollen bellies, the androgynous features, all of it was put on public display. This wasn't an act of humility. It was an act of supreme theological arrogance. He was declaring, "This is the new divine form. I am the template for godhood." This has chilling parallels to the 20th century's totalitarian movements. Leaders who, convinced of their own unique and pure ideology, attempted to remake society entirely in their own image, declaring history, tradition, and even objective reality to be flawed and in need of radical, violent correction. Amarna was a cult of personality on a national scale, centered on a leader whose physical and psychological state was inextricably linked to his radical ideology. He and his half-sister wife, the famous Nefertiti, produced 6 daughters, all depicted with the same telltale signs of congenital disorders. We know of at least 2 infant sons who did not survive. The art from Amarna is a family portrait of a genetic endgame, a dynasty documenting its own decay while proclaiming it as a new, divine perfection. He declared himself the sole intermediary between humanity and the Aten. He had, in effect, privatized God, but a new God cannot rewrite a damaged genome. Akhenaten's revolution, born of genetic desperation, was too radical, too alien for Egypt. When he died young, as was the fate of most men in his line, his entire system collapsed. The capital was abandoned to the desert sands. His name was chiseled from monuments, and the priests of Amun-Ra returned with a vengeance, eager to erase the memory of the heretic king. But they could not erase his genetic legacy. It had been passed on, like a ticking time bomb, to his son. A boy who would inherit a broken kingdom, a religious crisis, and a body so frail it would make him the most tragic and famous pharaoh in history. The boy who ascended the throne around the age of 9 in 1332 BCE was named Tutankhamun, living image of Aten. He would soon be renamed Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, a political move to signal the rejection of his father's heresy and a return to tradition. But while his name could be changed, his DNA could not. He was the son of a brother-sister pairing, Akhenaten and one of his sisters, and he was the ultimate tragic product of the Amarna experiment. The life of Tutankhamun is a profound lesson in the difference between power and strength. He was, in title, the most powerful person on earth, the ruler of a global superpower, worshipped as a living god. In reality, he was a disabled child trapped in a gilded cage of constant pain and ceremony. Modern analysis of his mummy, using CT scans and DNA testing, has painted a heartbreaking medical portrait. He had a severe, inwardly turned clubfoot on his left foot, making walking an agonizing, unbalanced ordeal. He suffered from Kohler's disease, a rare bone disorder that would have caused inflammation and pain in his feet. His spine was curved with scoliosis. He had a partial cleft palate, and most critically, his immune system was profoundly compromised. His body was a catalog of the genetic errors accumulated over generations. The discovery of over 130 walking sticks in his tomb was not a symbol of royal authority. They were medical necessities. These were the ancient world's equivalent of orthopedic devices, desperately needed to allow a crippled god-king to maintain the illusion of divine wholeness during public appearances. Imagine the ceremony. The chants of priests praising the pharaoh's divine strength, the prostration of subjects before his golden throne, all while the boy himself was carefully propped up, concealing the agony of a body that was failing him. This is where Tutankhamun's story transcends ancient history and becomes a powerful modern parable. His court was a perfect example of what social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance or collective illusion. Every single person in the royal court, the vizier, the generals, the physicians, the servants, knew the truth. They all saw the boy king stumble. They knew of his constant illnesses. They saw the evidence of genetic decay right before their eyes. Yet the system demanded that everyone pretend that everything was fine. The ideology of the divine pharaoh was so powerful that it overrode the observable reality. To acknowledge the king's weakness was to acknowledge a flaw in the cosmos, a failure of the state, a lie at the heart of their culture. And so, everyone participated in the lie. We see this pattern constantly in the modern world. In corporations with a failing business model that everyone is afraid to question because the CEO is committed to it. In political parties that cling to an outdated ideology, even as it leads them to defeat after defeat. In any hierarchical system where speaking truth to power carries a greater personal risk than participating in a comfortable, collective lie. The court of Tutankhamun is a cautionary tale about the danger of allowing ideology to blind us to empirical reality. His personal life was just as tragic. He was married to his half-sister, Akhenaten, herself, a carrier of the same damaged genetic inheritance. Their 2 children, both daughters, were stillborn. Their tiny, mummified fetuses were found buried with him in his tomb, silent, heartbreaking witnesses to a genetic line that had reached its dead end. At the age of 19, the boy king's fragile body finally gave up. DNA analysis revealed traces of the malaria parasite. For a healthy individual, malaria is serious but often survivable. For a young man with a compromised immune system and numerous other health issues, it was a death sentence. He likely suffered a fracture in his leg, which, due to his poor health, became infected, and the combination of infection and malaria was more than his body could handle. He died not in a great battle or as a result of a palace conspiracy, but as an invalid, succumbing to diseases his peasant subjects likely could have survived. The ultimate irony is that his fame is a direct result of his tragedy. His early, unremarkable death meant his tomb was small and easily overlooked in the Valley of the Kings, allowing it to escape the notice of tomb robbers for 3,000 years, preserving its treasures for Howard Carter to find in 1922. He became famous because his life was a failure. The golden mask that has become a symbol of ancient Egypt's glory is, in truth, the face of its greatest shame, a testament to a system that valued the purity of blood over the health of its children. One might hope that the collapse of the Amarna period and the obvious tragedy of Tutankhamun would have served as a permanent lesson for Egypt. And for several centuries, it did. Later dynasties, often founded by Libyan or Nubian generals, brought fresh genetic material into the royal line through foreign marriages. The practice of systematic sibling marriage waned, and the health and stability of the monarchy improved. The genetic well was slowly being cleansed, but the allure of the pure bloodline proved to be an idea too powerful to die. The cycle was destined to repeat one last time, in its most extreme and concentrated form. And ironically, it would be a foreign dynasty that would pursue this Egyptian practice to its ultimate destructive conclusion. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. When he died less than a decade later, his vast empire was torn apart by his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I Soter, seized Egypt as his prize. He and his descendants were Macedonian Greeks. They were outsiders, conquerors, ruling over a vast Egyptian population. To legitimize their rule, they made a fateful and catastrophic decision. They would become more Egyptian than the Egyptians. They looked at the ancient temple walls, read the religious texts, and saw the tradition of divine pharaohs marrying their sisters. They did not see it as a historical mistake to be avoided. They saw it as the secret formula for maintaining power. They adopted the practice not out of a deeply held, centuries-old religious conviction, but as a cold, calculated act of political strategy and cultural appropriation. This makes the Ptolemaic dynasty's story almost more damning than that of their pharaonic predecessors. They were not ignorant of the outside world. They were part of the vast, interconnected Hellenistic civilization. They chose to create a closed system. For the next 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty engaged in the most intensive program of royal inbreeding in human history. The family tree ceases to be a tree and becomes a tangled, suffocating vine, a ladder where the same names appear over and over. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and the genetic pool shrank with each generation until the royal family was a knot of impossible relationships. This provides a fascinating lesson in political theory. The Ptolemies were attempting to solve the problem of the other. By refusing to marry into the native Egyptian nobility or foreign royal houses, they maintained their distinct Macedonian Greek identity, setting themselves apart from their subjects. Yet, by adopting the ancient pharaonic custom of incest, they presented themselves as legitimate inheritors of Egyptian tradition. It was a paradoxical strategy: maintain purity by adopting a pure local custom. The result was predictable. The later Ptolemaic rulers were, by all accounts, a gallery of pathologies. The dynasty was plagued by intrigue, assassination, and civil war, much of it fueled by the physical and likely psychological instability of its rulers. Obesity, lethargy, and erratic behavior became hallmarks of the royal line. This brings us to the last and most famous of her line, Cleopatra VII. Born in 69 BCE, she was the product of over 250 years of this intensive inbreeding. The popular image of her as a breathtaking, flawless beauty is almost certainly a myth, a product of Roman propaganda and Hollywood fantasy. While she was undoubtedly charismatic and intelligent, she likely bore the physical markers of her lineage: the prominent Ptolemaic nose, a slightly protruding jaw, and other subtle asymmetries. Her genius, and the trait that seemed to survive the genetic wreckage, was her intellect. She spoke as many as 9 languages, was educated in mathematics and philosophy, and was a shrewd and ruthless political operator. Her brilliance was her survival mechanism. She had to be smarter, more cunning, and more charming than anyone else because she could not rely on the physical vigor that her ancestors had squandered. Her famous affairs with 2 of the most powerful men in the world, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, must be seen in this genetic context. They were not merely acts of political alliance or romantic passion. They were acts of biological desperation. She was making a last-ditch effort to break the cycle, to inject healthy, foreign genetic material into her poisoned family tree. Her children with these Romans, Caesarion, and the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, represented the only hope for the genetic salvation of her dynasty. But it was too late. The political machinery of Rome proved even more relentless than the genetic decay of the Ptolemies. After Cleopatra and Antony's defeat at the Battle of Actium, Caesar's heir, Octavian, could not allow rival claimants to his power to live. Caesarion was executed. The other children were taken to Rome, their fates uncertain but their claims to power extinguished. The last hope for genetic redemption was wiped out. In 30 BCE, when Cleopatra chose suicide by the bite of an asp over the humiliation of being paraded in a Roman triumph, she was doing more than ending her own life. She was ending a 300-year-long genetic experiment, and with it, 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. The Ptolemies had come as conquerors, but in the end, Egypt's most destructive idea had conquered them. They had gazed into the abyss of pharaonic tradition, and it had consumed them utterly. The story of Egypt's royal inbreeding is not just a dusty chapter in a history book. It is a timeless and deeply relevant parable for the modern world. The cycle that repeated itself across millennia, power leading to an obsession with purity, which in turn leads to isolation and collapse, is a pattern that humanity seems doomed to rediscover. The pharaohs believed they were preserving a divine essence by keeping their bloodline pure and uncontaminated by outsiders. Today, the language has changed, but the underlying impulse remains. We see it in the resurgence of ethno-nationalism, which preaches the superiority of a pure national or racial identity and views outsiders and immigrants as contaminants. We see it in ideological echo chambers, both online and off, where political movements or social groups isolate themselves from differing viewpoints, creating a pure intellectual environment that is brittle, intolerant, and incapable of adapting to reality. We see it in corporate or institutional cultures that prize conformity and reject outside ideas, eventually stagnating and being outcompeted by more diverse and dynamic rivals. The fundamental lesson, written in the mummies of crippled kings and stillborn princesses, is this: purity is a fantasy and isolation is a death sentence. Diversity is the engine of survival. Genetic diversity brings strength, resilience, and the ability to adapt to new threats. Intellectual diversity brings innovation, critical thinking, and the ability to solve complex problems. Cultural diversity brings a richness of perspective and a more robust, dynamic society. In every case, the principle is the same. Closed systems fail. Open systems thrive. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered as gods. Instead, their bodies, preserved in their golden tombs, have become humanity's most powerful testament to the laws of biology. Their suffering has become our wisdom. Their tragedy is our lesson. They stare at us across 3,000 years, from behind masks of gold and wrappings of linen, and they whisper a warning. They warn us against the seductive allure of purity. They warn us that the moment we believe we are too special to mix with others, the moment we build walls to keep the world out, is the moment we begin to decay from within. The greatest secret of the ancients is not a hidden treasure or a lost technology. It is the simple, terrifying truth that any society, any ideology, any nation that obsesses over its own purity is already building its own tomb.